Luxemburg's work. Nonetheless, the popular outcry about this, or the popular interest in it, did prompt a number of scholars to have a look again at where we stand in non-Muslim readings of the Qur'an. Angelika Neuwirth made the comment that we could just let Luxemburg sink and the scholarly community could allow him simply to pass in silence. But that's what had been done with Lühling, Günter Lühling, who had written a very thick book, self-published, about what he called the Ur-Qur'an, the original Qur'an, which he identified as a Christian text. She said we let him pass in silence because we didn't think he was worth spending the time responding to. And then he goes around to everybody and says, well, see, they can't answer the case that I've made. So she said, I think we need to deal with Luxemburg and to address this in a seriously scholarly way so that he will not be able to say the arguments have not been taken seriously and disproven. There's little doubt that this pseudonymous work has been useful in sparking a renewed attention to the relationship between the Qur'an and the lingua franca of much of the Middle East in the years when Islam was emerging, that is to say, Syriac. I say it's pseudonymous. The gentleman in question, although he adopted a name which makes him sound like a venerable German professor of theology, philology, is in fact a Christian from Syria, living in Germany and working in Germany, but the choice of pseudonym tends to suggest a claim to an authority which perhaps he should not have. However, because of the hermeneutical and theological presuppositions underlying his work and the lack of a clear understanding on his part, I think, of how languages function and develop, one wonders whether his approach has not muddied the waters rather than clarifying them. For those of you who don't know his work, he's proposing really that he can unlock for us the original meaning of the Qur'an, which he says has until now been held prisoner by the failure of the Islamic tradition and the non-Muslim scholars who have effectively followed that tradition, our failure to appreciate the role of what he calls Syro-Aramaic in the formation of the Qur'an and its language. That is to say, he sees underlying the Arabic of the Qur'an really another Mischsprache, as he calls it, a mixed language of Syro-Aramaic, and poor fools who've been reading the Qur'an all these centuries didn't realize that it wasn't actually in Arabic, it was really in another language. And if they had understood the language that it was in, and you can change lots of things by moving dots, then they would have understood that it's basically a Christian lectionary, which has been badly misunderstood for hundreds of years. Behind the aim he has of unlocking, as he puts it, the original meaning of the Qur'an, there lies an assumption that the real meaning of the Qur'an is to be found in the text itself, or rather, perhaps behind the text in the mind of the original author. Luxemburg's work and others who follow him show little appreciation of the notion that the meaning of a text is not simply found in the mind of the author, but rather in the mind of the reader, or perhaps better still, in the complex relationship between the text and its readers in their contexts, which is what we've been talking about until now. Luxemburg seems to espouse the reconstructionist hermeneutics of a Schleiermacher or a Dilthey, leaving unexamined the important critique of that approach and the vast amount of reflection on hermeneutical issues that has taken place in the last century. This same hermeneutical naivete drives the popular interest in Luxemburg's reconstructions of what he sees as the original text. It's perhaps instructive to note that the vast majority of journalistic attention was devoted to Luxemburg's proposed rereading of Qur'an 5572, that's Surat Ar-Rahman 72, substituting white grapes for the fair virgins who, according to the traditional reading of the word hur, await the faithful in paradise. This is significant, and I don't know how many people have asked me about that. Did you realize, have you heard this new book that explains that this is not there are no virgins in paradise, there are just white grapes? It's significant not simply because it represents a return to a classical trope of anti-Muslim polemics, that is to say, the lascivious Eastern Muslim who does things simply for the sake of sex, compared to the unlascivious, cool, rational Westerner. Not just that, but it reflects a perception that the modern phenomenon of Muslim suicide bombing has its origins in a particular reading of the Qur'an, a tendentious reading at that, and that the way to deal with the current crisis in relations between Muslims and others is simply to discredit such a reading. In the popular mind, perhaps, and we can see this maybe in the Danish cartoons also, the Qur'an is, if I may put it this way, a ticking bomb that needs somehow to be defused. And so you think you can defuse this ticking bomb simply by making a philological argument about the word hur. Yet there seems to go along with this fear that the Qur'an is, and a misreading of the Qur'an is at the basis of all our current political ills, there's very little awareness of or attention to the many other factors, both political, economic, and cultural, that fuel the rage that sometimes expresses itself in violence. Unfortunately, the resolution of the current dramatic situation will not be philological. The unwary philologist, and there have been many among the non-Muslim readers of the Qur'an, claims to dig up for us the original and therefore the real meaning of the words. The real meaning of the Qur'an is to be found in what it actually says to actual people, in a privileged way, of course, to the community of believers for whom it is more than simply an ancient text. For a number of non-Muslim scholars, and among them I include myself, the avocation of Quranic studies goes beyond academic interest and the pursuit of scholarly excellence. It is a way of engaging seriously with other believers on what to them is Scripture, and more than Scripture. Because of the way sacred texts function in believing communities, significant new readings of the Qur'an will more likely emerge from an engagement with the world in front of the text, that is to say, with the readers of the text, rather than from the archaeology of the world behind the text. Quranic studies might benefit from the continuing discussion in biblical studies over the just equilibrium between, on the one hand, a historical critical analysis that excavates and so continually fragments the text, and on the other hand, a rereading that takes the text seriously as a canon, as a sacred text for a community that is read as a whole, not simply in little bits. There is space and there is a need for both of those things, but in Quranic studies, as in biblical studies, the former, the atomizing archaeological interest, has tended to overwhelm and dominate the canon approach. There's been a backlash against this kind of thing in Christian biblical studies, and we refer to it as canon criticism, which is not an ideal way of putting it, but the idea is simply to go beyond the historical critical method which simply breaks things up and says, oh, this is an Assyrian word which was used once in a text 1,000 years before the book of Genesis, and therefore it means this and that. But to take the text seriously as read in a community of believers. The popular response, and even some of the scholarly response to Luxemburg's work, seems to reflect a desire to see the foundations of the Qur'an discredited. And along with the discrediting of the Qur'an, to see the discrediting of the Muslim faith. It is presented, the Qur'an is presented either as a Christian or this kind of work seems to be a kind of attempt by Jews or Christians to repossess the Qur'an, to say this is really, if only you knew it, this is really our text. We can think of Luling or Luxembourg, or on the Jewish side in the 19th century, Abraham Geiger. What did Islam take from or borrow from Judaism? So there's a movement, and this is one of the major trajectories, I think, a kind of repossessing, foreclosing on it. You've had this for long enough, and now we are going to prove that it really belongs to us. There's either that kind of attempt to discredit, or the other kind is to discredit the transmission of the text. And a lot of the popular interest, I think, in the Sana'a fragments, as witnessed that Atlantic Monthly article by Toby Lester, which is so often trotted out. Everyone is waiting for the evidence to say that the transmission of the Qur'an is not as solid and as convincing as the Muslim tradition would have it. And this is a kind of second leg to the dispossession, shall we say, of the Qur'an. The claim that underlying the structure and numerous elements of the text are originally Christian, as in the case of Luxembourg or Luling, or Jewish, Geiger, seems to reveal a desire to dispossess the Muslim community of its foundation and its greatest treasure. Yet even if the case were proven that the Qur'an reconfigures and reinterprets tropes from earlier sacred oral and textual traditions, what would that indicate? Again, comparisons with biblical studies might be instructive. The observation that several elements of the Hebrew Bible are a reworking of material from older religious traditions of the ancient Near East does not mean that the Bible has no unique and coherent vision of its own. The observation that the infancy narratives or the passion narratives about Jesus in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke seem to be taking their cue from elements in the prophetic literature and in the Psalms, rather than simply from an historical memory of events, does not, in the Christian mind, thereby discredit the Gospels. Both the Hebrew Bible in its various books and the New Testament in its various books are recognized as being rereadings and retellings of the same body of literature. And that we accept that. We accept that it does not cut the ground from underneath the text simply to say that it is related to other texts. And this brings me to the second trajectory. The second trajectory, which fortunately is represented by a larger group of scholars, I think, and more important scholars, is a trajectory towards seeing the Qur'an as a shared text rather than one that has been repossessed. It's a hope for a new reading of the Qur'an, or various new readings of the Qur'an, that would form the basis of a constructive relationship between those who read the Qur'an in faith and those who may not regard it as revelation. New readings are generated not simply by analysis, that is, by breaking down the text. I think they are created by catalysis, that is, by establishing new bonds and new relations among the elements of the text itself and with the contexts in which it's read. So in the process of catalyzing new readings, the philologists and historians, even if not believers, also have their role, not because they have some special insight into the real meaning of the text, but because they can offer to the believing reader an eye for the rich complexity of the textual elements and a knowledge of the history of their reception and interpretation in the many contexts that together make up the Muslim tradition. More than that, however, they can offer some understanding of the Qur'an's interlocutors. And this seems to me to be key, and it's something which which Professor Lawson said before. You know, the Qur'an was not in the first place addressed to Muslims with a capital M, because the Qur'an is trying to make Muslims with a capital M. The Qur'an addresses itself to the people of late antiquity with their Jewish, their Christian, their Arab, their Hellenistic background, trying to draw them towards Islam. So it's, in a sense, it is a text which predates Islam, we should say. Mm-hmm. It calls itself several times tasdiq, a confirmation of what has come before, and more than that, tafsil, an explicitation of what has come before. We might even change this title and think in this context of the Qur'an as exegesis. The Qur'an is presenting itself as the real reading of what has been going on before, the real reading of the Kitab, the real reading of the tradition that has been revealed to Christians and Jews and all the other people who have received a prophet. So the Qur'an is engaging that history. So I'd just like to mention a few of the scholars, non-Muslim scholars, who are working in this area with their slightly different styles and directions. There's a rather a short article by Whitney Bodman from the Austin Presbyterian Seminary in the Muslim world, and he speaks of reading the Qur'an as a resident alien, which I think is a very telling phrase. A resident alien. So he belongs, but he doesn't belong. This is not entirely foreign to him, and yet he is not utterly at home in it. So he has this sense that we read the Qur'an not as something that to be kept at a distance, but we read it even as non-Muslims from inside, and with our own particular way. Resident aliens don't experience, and I can say this as a resident alien. Actually, I'm a non-resident alien, tell the truth. We aliens don't experience Northern Virginia the way real Northern Virginians do. Resident aliens reading the Qur'an don't experience the Qur'an in the same way Muslims do. But nonetheless, we can inhabit it as a friendly space, as a space that is engaging and enveloping of us. Taking this a little further, the Belgian scholar Michel Kuipers, who works in Cairo at the Dominican Institute, has published recently, well, it came out recently in translation, his analysis of Surah 5, Surah Al-Ma'idah. The translation came out published as The Banquet. Kuipers belongs to a group of Christian scholars who work on what they call Semitic rhetoric. They discern within biblical texts of various kinds and other Semitic texts rhetorical styles and structures which are characteristic of those texts. And he, as an Islamic scholar also, immerses himself in the Quran text using this same kind of rhetorical analysis of the structures. And interestingly, this is not an attempt to say, well, this is really ours. It's really saying, yes, this is not a foreign document. This is a thing which lives in the same space as all the revelatory scriptures that Christians are used to dealing with. Its modes of thought, its modes of rhetoric are common. It's a very interesting work and has had very good reception among Muslim readers. He was given an award in Iran for this work. A number of non-Muslim readers of the Quran are very struck by something which is uncharacteristic perhaps of so much of the biblical text, and that is to say what we call the self-referentiality of the Quran. and a number of scholars under the leadership of Stefan Wild from Bonn University, and along with Angelika Neuwirth and others, are working away at this question of the Qur'an's attitude to itself. The Qur'an's constantly speaking about itself, which is, the Bible doesn't know anything about the Bible. The Bible doesn't talk about the Bible. Even in the New Testament, when Paul talks about Scripture, he's not talking about what's in the New Testament, he's talking about what's in the Hebrew Bible. So it is, to a large extent, although not entirely, unself-conscious. Yet the Qur'an is very strikingly self-conscious. My own work would be looking at whether we take that a little too far, and questioning whether everything that we read as being self-conscious and self-referential is really so. Or whether when the Qur'an talks about kitab, it's not simply talking about itself, it's talking about a whole larger reality. When the Qur'an speaks of ayat, it's not simply talking about verses of itself, it's talking about the revelations of God in nature and history and so on. Beyond that, I think a scholar who is moving in his position, again a Catholic scholar, Gabriel Reynolds, who recently published pardon me, The Qur'an and Its Biblical Subtext. I think he has moved, it seems to me, away from the Luxembourg trajectory to a trajectory where he is acknowledging he's not making a claim to own the Qur'an, although the title is perhaps a little misleading, because it plays into this idea that the original text of the Qur'an is somehow biblical. He's making a claim, and I think he does it very convincingly, that the Qur'an is engaging, as it itself says, saying it is tasdiq and saying it is tafsir, it is engaging with a pre-existing tradition. And if we read it together with the pre-existing tradition as it is known still in the Christian and Jewish traditions, we understand much more of the richness of the Qur'an. We pick up some of the allusions, we pick up some of the puzzling terminology of the Qur'an, which if you read it in isolation doesn't always make immediate sense.